fantastic interview about an issue that I've been trying to think about more, grapple with more.
You know things are getting serious when Anna Kasparian starts talking about men's issues. Along with Vaush and whoever these other two people are. I've watched the video and at no point do I mention them. So I've got no idea who they're meant to be.
Recently, there were some statistics by healthcare company Cigna indicating that men are the loneliest generation. In fact, 18 to 24-year-olds are...
For just a moment, I thought that statistics from a healthcare company might be healthcare statistics. You know, things like life expectancy, or spending on healthcare research, or spending on the provision of healthcare. But no, of course not. But of course it's loneliness. The one issue that the feminists feel comfortable talking about.
Lacking friends, intimate partners, they're feeling increasingly alienated from society. And when you look at statistics in regard to their education, whether or not they're working...
Maybe I've just got low standards, but bonus points for at least mentioning education. I don't expect them to go any further, but, you know, that's better than I was expecting.
More and more of this data reinforces that there is something awry. And addressing it doesn't mean that you turn your back on issues pertaining to women.
Of course, that would be their priority. But the reality is that there's a limited amount of resources, a limited amount of time, a limited amount of mind space for people who want to cope with these issues. Any significant attention being given to men's issues must inevitably mean deprioritising women's issues, and so it should. That's probably a good thing.
But it does mean that we should be focused on what it is in society that is leading to this epidemic, what the left can do to offer solutions.
You know, that's what I care about, solutions. So, I'll be really happy if there's actually any policy provisions in this entire video. But I won't be holding my breath.
And how we can basically fight back against the more nefarious figures who have filled the void that, you know, men are struggling with, people like Jordan Peterson and what have you.
One of the reasons this whole thing is doomed to failure is because they make it so explicit that the whole thing is aimed solely at recruitment. They just don't want people going over and becoming Andrew Tate fans or whatever, which is fine. It's understandable to not want that, but maybe you could actually care about these issues. Seem to have a genuine interest, rather than just doing this out of fear that you might lose supporters.
Now, recently, Vaush, who's a popular streamer, had tweeted this thread that I think is really, really important to address. He writes, "I cannot stress enough how important it is to understand that 12-year-old white boys on Twitch are not being pulled into fascism because of some Machiavellian desire to preserve and expand their privileges. It's because the right talks to them and the left doesn't." He continues to argue that leftists and progressives have absolutely no idea how unnecessarily repellent they come off to so many people, and they get angry at the idea of being a more effective social movement because they don't want to share their social spaces with people who might have gone another way.
If leftists didn't want to share space with people who could have gone the other way, then Xander wouldn't have a career. Everyone loves a repentant member of the other side. The problem is nothing more or less than a reluctance to deal with the actual issues, which we're going to see throughout this entire video.
But the criticism for leftists continue, and to be honest, I agree with a lot of what Vaush says here. He says leftists will write master's theses on the effect of socioeconomic conditions on crime, and then shrug when 10 million more young men fall into fascism because their boy brains must just be innately fascist and they choose to be evil, and there's no way this could have been prevented. And then the final tweet, because I want to make sure you guys get a full look at what he's thinking here. This is always a good topic to feel smug over because the replies and quote tweets are saturated with people who literally think, quote, "we should care about men's problems and offer them advice" is a dog whistle for "we should build a Fourth Reich," thus proving the problem.
Well, Vaush has got some points there, but what he doesn't seem able to comprehend is that people have issues that aren't being dealt with. That's what makes people take specific political positions. He's talking about the left not talking to people, not giving people advice, but the problem is, that advice can't really help deal with systemic issues. If you're going to get a longer sentence for the same crime or a lower mark for the same piece of work, then there isn't really anything you can do to give people advice that's going to materially help them. Because addressing problems for individuals doesn't actually remove those systemic issues.
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to something leftists tend to be more comfortable talking about, which is toxic masculinity.
Well, so much for the outreach program then. Just blame men's problems on masculinity, something that most men strongly identify with. Yeah, that won't alienate men at all. Well, there's really no possible defence for the use of the term toxic masculinity. Vaush cares about recruitment. Well, it's a word that's found deeply offensive by most men. 88% of men object to the term toxic masculinity. It's also denounced in academia and in psychology. And let's face it, it's mostly just used to describe anything done by men. So I really don't think it can reasonably be taken as anything other than just explicit victim blaming. Definitely not a good start there.
You know? Male loneliness is often an emergent property of toxic masculinity, which is, by the way, nobody likes this term, right? The right gets really upset when you say toxic masculinity because it sounds like you're upset with masculinity in general, and it's a really vague term. So,
of course, it's not just the right, or even just men, who find that term objectionable. And given how he seems to recognise there are major failings with it, maybe it would be a good idea to just not use that term at all. Makes you wonder what he is doing, really.
Let's just say, I think a lot of guys can be kind of antisocial because they're taught that sort of independence is a masculine virtue. They're taught that, there's value in keeping your feelings bottled up. Now, obviously, it's pretty harmful. It makes people feel kind of lonely. It makes them bad at reaching out to others, connecting, sharing their interests, building friendships.
Again, there's some recognition of men's problems here, but the blame is placed 100% on those men themselves. Nothing about emotional restraint or independence actually makes you incapable of expressing emotions. The reason that people don't express emotions is because there are explicitly consequences for doing that. In other words, it's a matter of external pressures which can't really be taken account of purely when you're looking at the individual. So you can't just say, well, a man's not expressing his emotions, that's all up to him, because it's not. We're also not looking at economic matters here, and obviously increasing loneliness on such a wide scale. That's not something to do with old-fashioned traditional gender norms or anything. That's something that's actually changed, and what's changed is economic factors and some social factors which have an explicit limit on men's behaviour.
I think it's one of the reasons why guys tend to view dating as sort of adversarial, because they don't think of like a woman as like, oh, well, maybe we'll just get along on some shared interests. Maybe we'll have something in common. They think of it as this like a mating battle, which, I don't think it has to be. And as a product of that, a lot of guys feel like they have no social inroads and they're kind of drifting through life without connections to people. It really sucks. And the left could, use that as an opportunity to maybe improve some people's lives, introduce them to some other ideas.
Man, this is stupid. Not just from an MRA point of view, but from Vaush's own recruitment-based point of view. If your position is that men are stupid and toxic and don't regard women as being people, then you're nothing short of delusional, and you're trying to demonise people and then pretending that you're trying to get them on your side. That's just not going to work. And again, a position that no real left-winger would ever take with any other group of people, that this is all your fault. All of your issues come from internal factors to you, and we're not even going to mention economic matters, we're not going to mention any other group, which will be women in this case. We're just going to say, you're toxic, you're stupid, you need to fuck yourself. Fucking, it's so, this is how people get alienated.
So just full disclosure, when the statistics first started coming out and they focused primarily on the lack of intimate partners, to be fair and completely honest with the audience, I was definitely more dismissive.
You don't say. I mean, that's why that gets the focus, right? That's why it's pity the incel, demonise the incel, ignore the incel, but it's never just, here's a political issue, here's a policy that we could use that could actually help. And we're now several minutes into this video, not a single policy, not a single thing to blame other than toxic masculinity. So, who's taking this seriously, really?
But then when you see the other statistics, including the lack of friends, workforce participation for prime working age men between the ages of 25 and 55 has actually decreased significantly, and specifically in the United States. And so, there have been some arguments that, oh, it's the advancement of technology, it's because of video games. Well, all of these technologies exist in other countries, and they're not experiencing the same decline in workforce participation. In fact, to give you a specific number from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, about 7 million prime working age men are not working and they're not looking for work.
These issues are actually quite widespread across the developed world, and why are we focusing on workforce participation exactly? Workforce participation is still higher for men than it is for women, and women seem to be doing fine. Maybe we could look at why that is, but of course we're not going to.
They're also self-medicating quite a bit. A huge portion of them have reported that they're taking painkillers daily. Deaths of despair are very prominent and pronounced among the male population versus the female population. These are huge issues. In fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics also noted that when it comes to unemployment among working age men, we have a 1937 economy.
Okay, so let's get to why this affects men and not women. Okay, let's cover these issues from a fact-based standpoint. Let's see what policies you've got to suggest.
There is a crisis happening, and I'm trying to figure out what is it exactly, right? The right wing will say, oh, it's feminism. It's because women don't want to stay at home and raise kids. They want to be independent. They don't want to enter, romantic partnerships, blah, blah, blah. I don't buy that for a second.
Well, there's another one for the list of definitions of feminism. Feminism is just when women are single. Well, if that's your definition of feminism, then yeah, okay, feminism would then not be to blame. But if we look at, say, the feminism education system, the effect of feminism on the education system, on the healthcare system, and so forth, then we start to get a very different picture of the responsibility that feminism and feminist activism have for many of these issues.
I do agree that some of the rhetoric is a problem, statements about toxic masculinity, a lot of generalizing about people.
Okay, nice one, Anna. Anna gets a point over Vaush there, because he's very big on toxic masculinity. He mentions it in all of these discussions. And Anna Kasparian seems to realise immediately just what a stupid idea it is, and just how harmful and offensive really it is.
I also think that there's a misconception that this is an issue that predominantly impacts white males, but that's actually not the case. The largest population that this impacts is actually Black men in America. And so this is a huge problem. And
does it only become a major problem when it mostly affects black people? But yeah, one of the core issues here is that poverty has a very different effect on men and women, and a far harsher effect on men. And black people happen to be more likely to be poor, so that's why we get these statistics. In fact, issues that are widely seen as black issues really don't affect black women at all, whether it's police violence or educational attainment, life expectancy, healthcare spending. All of these things are regions where black women have a significantly better position than white men. So, black issues, to some extent, yes, but those issues are mainly men's issues, and to some extent black men's issues. But how much care they get from certain people, especially people like Vaush and Anna, comes down to whether you call those black men men, in which case it's all due to toxic masculinity, or black people, in which case it's down to systemic racism. And that's not an approach that we can really sustain.
What do you think we need to say or frame, or how can we frame this issue so it's more palatable to the left, who, generally do want to ensure that every community is looked after, that everyone feels that, they're living a happy, prosperous life?
It's a tough sell. People feel these issues in their gut. When we talk about the kinds of things that drive people out to vote or even to throw revolutions, we're usually talking about very basic gut level problems that political analysis gets added to, For a long time in this country and many others, anti-immigration sentiment has been built on the anxiety of working class people who feel their jobs are threatened by immigrants.
So the question is, how can we get left-wing people to openly care about a disadvantaged minority, which is very much what we're talking about here? And Vaush's answer is, well, let's talk about a completely unrelated thing first, because I've got a lot more sympathy for immigrants.
Often the data doesn't bear that out, but it's their fear that's used as a catalyst to push those politics. The anxiety, the loneliness of young men, this has historically been used as catalysts for, well, I mean, basically everything from the Bolsheviks in Russia to the brown shirts in Germany.
So Vaush's outreach program so far is to blame toxic masculinity for everything, and then liken men to Nazis and the communist dictatorship of Soviet Russia. That outreach program really isn't going to go very well, is it?
It's just a large and often unaddressed demographic. This isn't a competition thing. We're not talking about giving up on feminist analysis or saying it's like, oh, well, actually, men have it worse than women. Or it's not about that. It's just you want to reach out to people where they are.
Has anyone ever heard Vaush say that, but in the other direction? When he was talking about abortion, was it all about how, well, we're not saying that women have it worse than men or anything. We're not talking about not focusing on men's issues, but maybe we should focus on just this one issue just now, just as outreach to women. No, of course not. He believes in patriarchy. He believes in all of this nonsense. And the reality is that any outreach program that starts with a position where men are inherently advantaged and privileged and just expected to do well because they're men is doomed to failure because it's so detached from reality. And if you're going to insist on patriarchy, feminist analysis, whatever else that reinforces those delusions, then you're never going to get anywhere.
And to start that process, with a lot of young guys, I think it would help if lefties were willing to acknowledge this sort of natural conclusion of toxic masculinity as like a mode of social analysis, which is if men are socialized in certain ways and treated in certain ways socially, it necessarily follows they must have specific problems. And if those problems are the product of social systems that are out of their control, I don't know why we wouldn't apply the same basic sociological lens of analysis to that as we would with literally anything else. Patriarchy, racism, transphobia.
Patriarchy. Well, there's your difference. That's the difference in how it's handled, right? You talk about, oh, well, we're not going to ignore racism or whatever, but you're also not going to say that we live in a black personarchy, right? That's not going to happen. Because reaching out to black people, dealing with black people's issues, never starts from a position of demonizing them, and rightly so. But when it comes to men, it's patriarchy, it's toxic masculinity. It's reach out to them by demonizing first, and then maybe pretend to care later. That's never going to work. This is the core problem with Vaush.
No individual has control over these systems, and we try to interweave analysis with our compassion for and respect for the individual problems people have. We do this all the time with other issues. And to an extent, we do it with men. But I feel like we lean off that a little bit. Maybe because men's rights as like a sort of a nominative thing, like how it's referred to, usually refers to misogynist or incel communities online. So it's like, oh, well, men's rights, you actually mean like this or that. Well,
and there speaks a man who has no interest in men's rights activism or men's rights issues. Now, I know what he's talking about here because I saw it in one of his other streams. He was talking about Vaush V. And I'm sure he could come up with some other names as well. Well, maybe anyway. But the problem is that Vaush V, of course, is not a men's rights activist. In fact, he has denounced the men's rights movement and been denounced by it in turn. In fact, he's denounced the whole concept of political advocacy or any form of political change. I really can't think of any honest reason why someone would call Vaush an MRA. On the other hand, there is of course an obvious ulterior motive here, which is to simply demonise his political opponents, but to demonise Vaush's political opponents in this case, by suggesting that they are pro-rape or whatever else it is that Vaush might be. I don't know, I'm not all that au fait with Vaush's content, seeing as I've never seen any of it. But yeah, this is basically Vaush lying and trying to give the MRM guilt by association, except that there is no association, he's just made it up in his head.
Leaving aside the baggage, right? You can call it what you want, men's advocacy, whatever, just common decency, it's still worth pursuing.
Yeah, I think the phrasing men's rights activists, it does unfortunately make one recall some of the most unsavory individuals imaginable, right? Some who think that rape should be legalized.
Yeah, that's Roosh. That's specifically a reference to Roosh. She says some individuals. She means one specific person with no connection to the men's rights movement at all. But that's who she's going to use to judge it, because she's dishonest and ideologically motivated, honestly.
So I don't like thinking about that group when it comes to this particular issue, because I don't think this is about male entitlement. I don't think this is about men feeling or fighting for a system in which men get to feel entitled to certain things in society, including, certain sexual acts, whatever it is.
I mean, whatever it is equality. It's equality in the education system. It's equal treatment in the classroom. It's equal treatment by doctors, by the police, and so on and so forth. It's not. It's not about legalizing rape, certainly. But add that onto the list with the Bolsheviks and the brown shirts and the toxic masculinity and so forth. And so far, of course, not a single policy suggestion, not a single issue being addressed other than loneliness, and 4 completely different forms of demonization of men. So, efficient feminism there.
This is really about making sure that people don't feel lonely, feel that they have purpose in life. That's the other thing.
So I don't want to minimise major issues like loneliness or purposelessness. But no, it's not about that. It's not about anything like that. It's about actual political issues, treatment in the education system, healthcare, the list that I keep having to repeat over and over again, because none of it is getting mentioned by these people. Worried about male involvement in the workforce? Well, teaching is a big issue there. You could get men into teaching and nursing and other traditionally feminine professions, and you could increase education to help men to get into more educated fields in general. How about that? Well, we're not going to mention that, because we're too busy talking about brown shirts at the moment. But maybe later. But no, not later.
An increasing number of young men feel like they have no purpose in life. And I think that it has to do with the fact that for the longest time, they were conditioned to believe that they are supposed to be the breadwinner in a family. And when they are lacking this educational attainment necessary to get the kind of career that makes the kind of money that makes them feel like the breadwinner, well, then it makes them feel like they're not.
So there's a legitimate point here, certainly, but it's got exactly the same flaw as everything else that they've said in this conversation. It's all focused entirely on the man having the problem and his own personal responsibility. Well, do men really feel less adequate if they aren't making as much money? Or do other people just react more harshly to them? Is it their own internal problem, or is it the value placed on them by society, and, in this case, also specifically by women? Well, they aren't allowed to talk about that because they're feminists, so we'll just have to talk about something else for the rest of this conversation.
Really worth anything. I see a lot of that going on as well. When you look at the number of college-educated men, that has declined significantly. And so some of the solutions that I've heard from...
Okay, solutions. This is the bit I find exciting now. And this is the bit that decides whether this conversation between Vaush and Anna is as horribly toxic as it seems so far, or if it might end up actually having some sort of benefit.
People who do take this seriously on the left is that, hey, there's a lack of male role models in, the public education system. There's a huge disparity between female and male educators in the public school system. Curious what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I agree. It is. I do think it's unfortunate that we consider education such like a feminized profession.
We were so close. We were so close. I actually had hope for a minute there, because, that's a major issue, and they're actually talking about it, sort of. But it's not unfortunate. It's not something that happens purely by chance and happenstance. It's not something that happens in a vacuum, right? The lack of male teachers is a result of specific social and economic forces. And the decline in male teachers has pretty much perfectly coincided with the rise of the feminist movement. Which, I can't show you any studies on this, but that involves a lot of demonization of men, a lot of presentation of men as being dangerous and violent and so forth. And what I hear from a lot of male teachers who leave the profession is that there's a lot of paranoia about men being predatory towards children. So, once upon a time, men weren't a tiny minority of the teaching profession, but now, tiny minority, and getting smaller all the time. And what Vaush and Anna are not going to say is what we should actually do about that. because they don't think that there's anything that we should do about it.
Not because there's anything wrong with female teachers or whatever, but obviously people take a lot from their education. And
the American left really has a weird fetishization for teachers, especially seeing as they are one end of the school-to-prison pipeline. I mean, they're basically cops, but also they're basically all middle-aged, middle-class white women who are the sacred cows of the American left. So they get a lot less criticism than they should do. And when it comes to education, a lot of the gender gap comes specifically from explicit gender discrimination by those teachers. But again, it's an issue that Vaush and Anna probably aren't even well enough informed to know about, and definitely aren't going to allow themselves to talk about.
any significant disparity in representation is going to reflect some kind of social value. So, I mean, we can see the need for this reflected in the fact that two of the largest breakout conservative figures in the past 5 years, respectively, Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, both became powerful in exactly the same way. That is to say, they postured as like self-help gurus for young men who felt like they'd been failed by society and left no options to better themselves otherwise.
Even here, it has to be young men who feel like they've been failed by society, and not just young men who have been failed by society. He can't bring himself to do anything other than victim blame. And it's very sad. It shows just how limited the thought patterns of a feminist are allowed to be.
You know, progressivism with being a masculine guy. A lot of women you might want to date kind of do like manly guys, at least some of them, right? But, what does it mean to be manly in a context that isn't, Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson? Just having the conversation might get a lot of folks invested, or they might understand that the left is interested in these issues beyond a sort of token, surface level political skim where they're trying to get people off the top. Compassion.
I really don't get where he gets this idea that manliness and being left-wing are inherently contradictory. I mean, if you go back only a few decades, you'll find white men as the core left-wing voter bloc, back in the days when it was all about unionisation. Of course, in the decades since, left-wing parties have largely become neoliberal. Identity politics has become a much bigger factor than trade unions and income changes. And so, the sort of organised left has effectively distanced itself from the working class man. And that's what creates the current situation. There is nothing inherently anti-left wing about being manly. In fact, traditionally, it's exactly the opposite of that. And I edit out a load of stuff about Peterson and Tate. I don't care about them.
Yeah, compassion's the right word, I think. And,
No. Compassion is the wrong word. Compassion is maybe, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's very much the most minimum basic thing that ought to be expected. Does anyone on the left wing ever talk about feeling compassion for racial minorities or for women or whatever other fashionable group they're working on? No, of course not, because that's expected. Instead, it's about activism, it's about specific issues, and that's just what they're not talking about today. Interesting, they started talking about solutions, and then had no solutions to suggest whatsoever, because they'd all be against established feminist policy.
You got a lot of backlash for talking about this, and you might tweet about it, but where I've heard you actually talk about this issue at length is on your streams. And I think you're thoughtful in the way you talk about this issue, but you still get hit with, oh, you're just a secret right winger from your critics, right?
It's been known to happen. I know
what's behind that, because I feel like that is what most of, at least the online left, I don't know if I can say that about the left in general, they seem to spend a lot of time going after one of their own who might have some ideas that are a little different, or might have concerns that are a little different from their own.
It's weird that she should say this about feminism, because people accuse Vaush of being right-wing for a wide variety of reasons, whether it's his support for NATO, or for corporate curbs on free speech, or for any one of a number of other issues. I'd call him right-wing because he supports feminism. It's a pretty inherently conservative ideology. It's not an area where he doesn't share the same thoughts as mainstream left-wing opinion. So It's a bit of a strange question from Anna there.
Well, the gatekeeping tendencies of the left are how you know you're a leftist, right? If you're a good leftist, the people you hate most should be other lefties. It's the only way to know.
I'm a great leftist then.
Yeah, we're phenomenal leftists. I think there's kind of like I don't want to overuse the term, or maybe use it lightly, the term trauma, but I feel like after the past decade of online discourse, people are very sensitive, especially on the left. People are very sensitive to the idea that we need to treat men better, not necessarily because they disagree with the idea of treating men better. That seems like a nice thing to do broadly. I would hope a lot of people would agree with that, but rather because we need to treat men better has often been couched in this very ideologically loaded set of policy and social prescriptions that usually have to do with undoing the gains of feminism.
Well, we're getting pretty close to the end of this video now, and so far there hasn't been any discussion of even a single policy. Literally not one. Not about any issue, whether men's issues or otherwise. So, I'm going to guess that's not going to change now.
Or, at the very least, negating the harms that women experience socially because of, patriarchy or inequality.
Patriarchy again.
I fully sympathize with the sensitivity. I mean, I've been online for a while. I see how the discourse tends to go. But we have to be strong enough to understand when a dog whistle isn't a dog whistle, when it's just a term. I would hope that...
Again, is there any other disadvantaged group where any sort of activism for them would be, well, you say you're in favour of black rights, but maybe you're like a black Hebrew Israelite or something? No, but, he's the person who just said that the men's rights movement is brown shirts and Bolshevik revolutionaries and all the rest of it. So, we can't really expect a lot of rigour here. We certainly can't expect any sort of examples of what he's claiming, because you won't be able to provide any, because, the men's rights movement is traditionally very egalitarian. There are some tradcons in there, and various other, diverse ideological groups, but on the whole, it's far more egalitarian than the feminist movement.
A lot of lefties could understand. You may have an aversion to the capital M, capital R men's rights movement, a justified one. But to the outside, when you seem to be taking a stance against the concept of men's rights, people who aren't as familiar with the context of that discourse might interpret that as you literally politically being opposed to men doing all right, which doesn't do great for them recruitment numbers. We could really use those. Things in the country aren't going great right now, and bereaved masculinity is basically the front line. It's the bulwark.
Bereaved masculinity. Yeah, alright. So, there are a lot of social issues going on, and most of them are about men's rights issues. Is it men who are upset about transsexuals in the toilets? Or is that feminists who are demonising transsexuals that they perceive as being men? Who are the homeless? Who are the people who don't have healthcare for the most part? Who are the people who are apparently declining in workforce participation and in educational attainment and all the rest of it? The fact is, any left-wing issue is really a men's rights issue right now, and for the last few decades. These are issues which pretty much all disproportionately affect men rather than women. So, maybe we could stop pretending there's a patriarchy, or that it's all down to toxic masculinity or the individual actions of men instead of, for example, discrimination, the thing that he's going to refuse to bring up in any discussion of men's rights issues.
Of, the fascist movement that's growing in this country. Steve Bannon was specifically recruiting from incel forums.
And that's one more little piece of demonisation. Steve Bannon, black shirts or brown shirts. Bolsheviks, of course, toxic masculinity, patriarchy. It's, just one long string of pieces of demonisation of the people that he's supposedly reaching out to. And still not a single discussion of any sort of policy, any actual men's issue beyond, I suppose, loneliness, which got mentioned early on. Education, of course, was brought up, and then pretty much instantly dropped. So this conversation has gone pretty much exactly as I should have expected it to.
Those Andrew Tate 12-year-old TikTok flossing tweens or whatever are not going to grow up to vote for Biden when he's 105 years old. There is a trend that's happening right now. There is a group of people looking for answers, and that's young men who do feel listless.
Feeling listless. Feeling listless is the big issue that men have, according to Vaush. Fuck. There's so many political issues. There's so much just outright discrimination. And some of it, if you actually confronted Vaush about it, I'm sure he'd accept. But he's not going to bring it up voluntarily. And so, we get this conversation on men's issues, when men's issues hardly even come up. Where most of the time is spent on either demonising men, demonising men's rights activists, or on talking about how necessary it is, of course, it goes without saying, without question, to support feminism and feminist analysis, and to focus on women's issues as much as men's issues. So, a complete waste of time, in other words.
I agree with you on that. I'm going to leave you all with one final statistic, and this is incredibly alarming. A May 2021 poll from the Survey Center on American Life revealed the number of American men who view themselves as having no close friends quintupled over the last 30 years, increasing from 3% in 1990 to 15% in 2021. So for anyone who thinks that this is just about male entitlement to sexual activity...
You're the one who's bringing that up, right? Anna there. The only one who's bringing up that idea, that this is all about some form of sexual entitlement. Like, no one else has mentioned that. There's no reason to bring that up, right? You could be spending this time on actual issues, you know, on educational discrimination or whatever else. But no, instead we get these, like, backhanded insults. Hey, it's not just about that, alright? No.
You're mistaken. Open your eyes, look a little harder, because if you consider yourself a progressive or a leftist, the whole ideology is to want to uplift people, pick people up when they're down, and immediately dismissing this very clear issue that continues to grow in the country, I don't think is the right way to go. I think the left needs to offer better solutions. And to be completely frank, I don't know exactly what those solutions are yet.
I mean, maybe if you paid more attention to men's rights activists than just pretending that they want to legalise rape, you know, pay some attention to the people who have for decades been spending time on coming up with actual solutions to these problems, the problems that you spent decades denying even existed, then maybe you would have solutions to these problems, instead of just vaguely recognising that a couple of problems exist. But I suppose that will get in the way of all the demonisation. And that's about it then. And yes, as I suspected, not a single policy prescription in the entire video. Not a single recommendation for anything that a government could do. Not a single recommendation for anything that someone wanting to do activism could do. Literally nothing recommended beyond, maybe compassion if you feel like it. And that's it. Yeah, that was a waste of time.